And we are live on the Gamification Revolution. Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Gabe Zichermann. I'm your host today. I'm coming to you from sunny, if a little bit hazy, Los Angeles. But you couldn't tell it's December because it's LA, and you can never tell what time of year it is. That's LA. And I'm joined today by Nick Yee, who's in Mountain View and from Quantic Foundry. Hello, Nick.
Hey Gabe, thanks for having me on.
Woohoo! So excited. Okay, and you guys, if it's your first time on the Gamification Revolution, welcome. You'll need to log in with one of your social media contacts here on Spreecast. And once you do that, you can actually ask us questions. You can ask us questions in the chat. You can ask us questions by coming online on video. And if you're not live with us and you're listening to this on the regular podcast, thank you so much. So nice to have you. You can join us every other week, typically on Thursdays at 1 o'clock Eastern for the live version of this show. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, go to your favorite podcasting platform and subscribe to it. That way you can get it even if you're not here and you can't be here on live. And look at all the people who are live, who I've missed so much. Beth and Dutch and David. Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Okay, so I am so excited to have you here, Nick. We met a while ago while we were both filming a really interesting documentary um, about games and their impact on the world, and you started
Yeah,
talking about some of the stuff that you were doing at Quantic Foundry. So tell us a little bit about just about Quantic Foundry first, and then this game motivation model, which I think is the thing that everybody wants to talk about.
sure. I've been studying the psychology of gamers for over a decade in academic settings and industry settings for the government, and then I worked at Ubisoft for 2 years. And then earlier this year, my longtime colleague and I, Nick Ducheneau, started our own consulting practice around data and gaming. So that's Quantic Foundry. And as we were, picking up clients and doing consulting gigs, we had a bit of free time. So we said, okay, what are we going to do in this free time? So we said, well, what if we play and gather data for a gaming motivations framework? We've been doing some of the motivation stuff before in the online games MMO space. So we said, let's try it here. And so we did something a little crazy. We said, well, what if we create a online app that people could take a 5-minute survey, they would get their results back, and as we got data, we could keep iterating, refining the model, and building it up from the ground up. So like building up with our bootstraps. And so we said it wouldn't be perfect at first, but it'd get better over time as we got more and more data. During our second iteration, it got picked up by Ars Technica, so on that day, we had a peak concurrent usage of 900 people on taking the survey in the same 5-minute window, and we have now over 140,000 gamers worldwide who've taken
Wow.
this gamer motivation model. Let me just do a
And I
quick
put a link,
link.
yeah, and I put the link in the chat
Okay,
so
cool.
everybody who's watching it can actually see the link right there.
So, I've put, a bunch of links on that page, so the first one is what a sample profile looked like. The way we created the tool was that when someone took the test, there was an easy way for them to share their profile on social media, whether Facebook or Twitter. And there was this, at the high level, a 6-point graph that really summarized your data. And so about 85% of our traffic was actually social media traffic. And it was really, Nick and I, we're academics. We've tended to do surveys in this very traditional style. And this was really our first foray into doing social science using social media. And so we learned a lot, as we were doing this, of just, it actually went viral in the Philippines first before anywhere else. It went viral in the Philippines, in Malaysia and Indonesia. It then circled back to Brazil and then the US. And so
Interesting.
we learned a lot, along the way. And so we had people from all over the world in different English-speaking countries take the profile. And what that let us do was to, apply statistical methods to understand how motivations, interest in storytelling, competition, achievement, discovery, which of these cluster together, which of them don't. And so in the second slide there in the link, I want to comment on Dutch's comment. My God, we had Google Analytics, on our computer dashboards for that whole week, watching like different parts of the globe light up depending on the day-night cycle. It was wild. And either Nick or
So
I, we were watching it like, a lot during that week.
So can we just go, let's go to the model for 1 second. Okay, so you've got this six-part model that's action, social, mastery, achievement, immersion, and creativity, right?
Yeah.
I got that right? Okay, so take a step back for a second. How did you come up with these six categories to begin with? Where are they from?
Yeah, so we actually started from the ground up. So in the basic level, we did not have this framework. We went to do a literature review of all the models and all of gaming motivations, types of fun, player types in the academic industry literature. So you have Barthold's types, you have Nicole Lazzaro's types of fun, you have Matt LeBlanc's aesthetics, and we went and we did that literature review of what are all the individual motivations that have been proposed within the literature. So we built up this table, this matrix of motivations and the paper that it's been listed in. We then generated survey items, for story, it may be, I think it's really important that a game has an elaborate story. I really like getting to know all the main characters in the game. I like characters with interesting backstories and personalities. And so for each of these motivations, we look at the literature, past surveys that have been done, come up with initial list of draft items. That's what we fed into the survey, and we kept iterating. We started off with a small sample, ran that, refined it, did a bigger sample, and again, it took about 2 to 3 iterations before we got big with the Ars Technica hit. So by the time Ars Technica came along, it was mostly robust, and so that allowed us to get a lot of data and do the final refinement and validation with the Ars Technica. So the statistical method that we use is called a factor analysis. It essentially clusters the motivations, and it tells you, so for example, people who well, the biggest surprise for us was competition and community, right? So people tend to think that collaboration and competition are on opposite sides of the spectrum, that they're two different things. What we found was that in our current kind of gaming context, people who score high on competition also tend to score high on collaboration. That the sense of teamwork, being in a team, and team versus team, that those are all bundled. They're correlated more than not. And so that's what the factor analysis does. It kind of shows how these motivations are correlated.
So, okay, so that's actually really interesting on multiple levels. You know, one of the things that's been missing, I think, from this space, and one of the reasons why it's so exciting to talk to you, is a little bit of that kind of data rigor. So really, bringing a kind of strict statistical analysis to this discussion about these gamer types and what they actually correspond to. You said that one of the things that surprised you was that there wasn't a ton of conflict between kind of competition and collaboration. What were some of the other things that you saw, that were kind of maybe counterintuitive or things that people wouldn't expect?
Yeah, so we started looking at gender and age differences because we had such a big sample. So at first glance, gender differences align with gender stereotypes. So the men were at a high level more driven by competition, by challenge, by destruction, by excitement. The female players seem to be more interested in fantasy and story and discovery and so forth. But we dug one step deeper and we found that age differences dwarfed the gender differences. So, for example, we can actually quantify the amount of variance that's explained by gender versus age. And for example, in the competition motivation, it's true that men score higher on that than women, but that the difference in age is about 3 times bigger than that in gender. And so we saw this
Can
in a
you
lot of
elaborate
the
on that?
motivations. Yes, so if you, I'm trying to think of,
Well,
I
specifically, so
think
you said that age trumps gender in competition motivation.
competition,
Does that, yeah, are younger people more competitive or older people?
younger. Yeah, so
Okay.
younger people are much more competitive. And so if you look at the difference between, gender, there is a difference, throughout the life cycle, but the difference between the youngest men and the oldest men is much, much bigger than the difference between men and women at any of the age intervals. So we found that difference. Another one was overall the motivations that changed the most over the life cycle were competition and excitement, and the ones that changed the least were strategy and discovery. Um,
Huh.
yeah. In the link that I had, go ahead.
Yeah. So does that mean, does that mean to you, and again, meaning may be a little bit elusive, right? Because we have relationships between data points rather than the explanation of why they are this way. But if you had to hypothesize about that, does that speak more to like you think the kind of ways that people's brains work, or maybe the ways that the kinds of games that they like? What do you think influences the fact that those things seem to move very little?
So I think there are like two broad classes of explanations. I think both of which could happen at the same time. So one is that we know that testosterone levels drop over the life cycle, for men especially, and it kind of aligns with what the data says. So what part of it could just be biological, that people, men get a lot less competitive as they get older. The other
Right.
kind of explanation is more kind of social structural, right? That as we get older, and we have families, that it kind of limits the kinds of games that we can play. So when you have a family and your gaming schedule is a lot more constrained, it's much harder to join a raid in World of Warcraft, for example. It's much
Right.
harder to play games that require you to have 30 minutes of uninterrupted, time. So it could be, both those things. It could also be, a combination of the games that are created right now and the people that they're marketed to. And it's hard to disentangle all of those at the same time. But, from the data perspective, we can kind of see right now what the gender differences are, what the age differences are, and how they are in relation to each other.
So that's really fascinating. Can we talk about a couple of these like motivations, maybe more specifically for a
Yeah,
second? Because
absolutely.
some of them are, exceptionally interesting, and I'm really curious to hear kind of what you found out about them. Okay, so one of the things is like one of the things that I'm really interested in is this question about the achievement motivation and the achievement kind of gamers. So we tend to put a lot of emphasis, certainly in gamification design, but also in maybe society in general, a lot of emphasis on achievement orientation and this idea of completing things and getting a certificate for completing them, and like making life a series of those things. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about what you found out about that particular motivation as it relates to people who've taken the survey?
I thought, what was interesting to us was the split between the power element and the completion element. So you can have people who are interested in becoming as powerful, like the min-maxing aspect of it, without necessarily caring about being thorough about the game. So they just want to figure out the most optimized way of leveling up. I want to level up and get to end level as quickly as possible versus the people who are more completionist minded and not necessarily power driven. So they may want to collect every possible costume or every possible trinket, but they're not really power driven. But it's easy to see how that there are people who are both at the same time. So I thought what was interesting was, under the within the model, every motivation within the same column are more highly related, correlated with each other, and less related to the things in different columns. And so completion and power tend to be correlated, for a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be. So there are people who are in one or the other. So it kind of, shows, this underlying, bifurcation of the two. So I thought that was what was interesting of being able to that it kind of teased out that distinction of the two.
I, yeah, and I've actually put for those who haven't done that, I've actually put a little screen up on that you can see the kind of motivation model with the six different categories, kind of the quick at a glance that Nick and the team there sort of prepared for you. So that's really interesting. figure out kind of like averages or kind of through lines for different groups of people along these six characteristics? Like, can
Sorry,
you
say that
say
again.
based on the data that you can you say based on the data that you have, can you say like, oh, here's an average American 18-year-old gamer, this is their profile, here's what they like?
Yeah, so we collected this data without knowing it would go viral, and once we got this data, we started playing around with it in a lot of different ways, and and figuring out all the cool things we can do with it. So let me grab this particular link. Uh, let me see if I got that right. So I'm putting up this slide in the chat. So what we figured out in the tool, every time a player comes through and takes a motivation profile, we ask them their gender, their age, and also to list some of their favorite games. And we did this because we figured it would let us give us a way to debug the tool if we ran into any ambiguities later on. Once we got data from so many people, we realized, hey, we could actually flip it around. If you give me the name of any particular game, so in this case, Europa Universalis, a grand strategy game, or you want to specify, I want to know about, women between the ages of 30 and 40 in Western Europe. What do their motivations look like, and what games are they currently playing? We can pivot in the data between games, gamers, and their motivations in these really powerful ways. And so, we can create these audience profiles for, 5 games or 10 games of your choosing, and then map the distance, from each other and actually visualize the proximities with each other. On the online tool that we've developed, we've created this personalized recommendation tool. So if you take the test, we find the 1,000 gamers around the world who are most similar to you and surface their favorite games to generate a list of recommendations, for you. So we're playing around with a lot of different ways of playing with the data. And again, we didn't think about doing any of this until we had the data in our laps. And every 2 weeks, Nick and I are looking at the data and we're like, hey, have you thought about this, or could we do this? And we go and try it out. And so we're in this phase of we're trying a lot of things with the data to see what makes sense and what we can do with it. And there are a lot of kind of surprising findings that have come out.
Have you found that if you have you gone back and kind of validated some of those connections with some of the users sort of directly? Have you found that people look at their gamer score and think that it's the kind of thing that their gamer motivation profile and feel like, yeah, that's me as a general rule? Are you getting positive feedback on that?
So yeah, so on the tool, like ever since we had this in the earliest iteration, we had a feedback button on the bottom. So when you got your report back, there was a way for you to tell us, did it feel accurate? Is there too much information on the report? What would you change and so forth. So like on a 5-point scale, it's tended, most of the responses are around the 4. So it's I think number 4 is very accurate. 5 was extremely accurate, and it's kind of improved over time. So overall, the reaction has been positive. I think there are a couple of things that we're still fixing in terms of, early on, some of the labels weren't quite right, and people were telling us, oh, I think it'd be better if you labeled it this. I think is what you really mean, and so forth, so forth. So we had made changes along the way to kind of smooth those interpretation issues out.
Do you, I think one of the interesting kind of challenges of designing these sorts of experiences, in certainly in the game space, and then I want to talk a little bit about applying this outside of games to a more broader, a more broad audience and to gamification. But one of the challenges I think is always like, there's this belief that games are kind of like at their core, they're very artistic products, and so it would be difficult to predict what somebody might actually like. That it's a very high risk proposition to take and create a game and put it in the world, and it's basically like, are people attracted to this art? But in some ways, it seems like you're saying there may actually be a mechanistic formula underneath there that people are either more attracted to or less attracted to, and it's one of the central tensions of gamer types in general. This idea. Do you think we can just like, if we got this tool to work really well, could we just, could game developers just be like, okay, So this is like all the people who have, high motivation around excitement and destruction and completion, and let's make a game, that just does those three things over and over again.
I don't know. I think that's a tough question. I think what we can do with a lot of this data collection is describe how gamers currently are based on the context of games that we have right now. But I think with any kind of social science project, what we're really never able to say is how the world ought to be. If we were free from the artifacts and consequences of marketing history and how games have developed. So what the data we have right now is based on the context and the history of game development. Here's where we are right now. Here are some of the how gender and age and gaming motivations intersect. Clearly there are ways that we can shake up the current world context, but this is kind of the starting point, and I'm able to describe that point right now. So there's certain things, for example, that we can see there are intersections, certain motivations in certain demographic areas that are a little more popular. Or, if we're working with game companies and they say, hey, I'm interested in developing a game that's high on X and maybe low on Y, and that game genre doesn't really exist. What kind of
Right.
games are those people currently playing? So we can answer some of those questions on a here's how it currently is level, but I think there's this bigger, like kind of more fundamental question is, how things ought to be. I'm not sure, social science can answer that question. That's much more of a philosophical question.
And that sort of David had actually asked a question that's very similar to what you just sort of answered, which is how game companies might, want to use these things. I think ultimately, like also to me, it feels like you'd want to use them to find underserved parts of the market at some point, like
Right.
saying like, oh, there's these groups of people who are not served. Because I remember working, in my last life as one of the co-founders of this company called Trimedia, which was a casual game distribution platform, online. And one of the things that we learned at that moment was like the big insight, the contrarian insight about casual games was that women wanted to play games, which was a contrarian insight, and that not just that they wanted to play games, but they didn't want to play stereotypically women games. Like it wasn't like Barbie dress up that they wanted to play.
Right.
They wanted to play games that they thought were meaningful. They just were different from the games that had been made at the time. So I think one of the interesting things at some point, as you gather more data, will be to start saying, hey, here are gaps in the market where there's groups of people who are really underserved because they don't have enough stuff, you know?
Yeah, and I think part of our age cohort data kind of taps into that, that we're so in the game industry, we're so focused right now on gender differences kind of still. But, as the gamers, our current gamer generation, as they get older, how do their tastes, change, as they age a little older? And what kind of games would they like, as they get older? And, that's kind of some of those long-term trends, and the gaps that you were saying that our data could kind of provide some insight into.
So Dutch did have one specific question for you about the Europa Universalis example,
Yeah,
and that's about the kind of the 78% strategy bar and its relation to the other attributes and also to the median. And I guess my question for you is on my side is the way that this the instrument is designed, and then maybe you can speak a little bit to Dutch's question, is the way that the instrument's designed that ultimately somebody could score like 100%. Like, is it theoretically possible for somebody to be at 100 on all six of them on the one of the two subsets? Is that how the thing is scored?
sure. So, all of these gaming motivations, as well as all the current standardized tools we have of measuring, say, personality and academic psychology, all these traits tend to fall on a normal distribution, a bell curve. So that's really how you should think about it. So there are a lot of people in the average, and then there are very few people on the extremes. And so in the same way that on any of these scales, it's possible, to score essentially on the 99th percentile, or the first percentile on any of these scales. For most people, if you go take the gaming motivation profile, you'll score average, I'd say, on about half of your motivations, and then you'll have a few that are quite high and a few that are quite low. on an individual level, that's what it tends to look like. On the game level, that's also the typical shape of it. Um, and of course, because games are aggregates of individuals, it's impossible for a game to score, say, at the 99th percentile because there's a regression towards the mean. So on the strategy front, Europa Universalis is actually, I think, if it's not the top game in strategy, it's probably in the top five in terms of the extremity of strategy. And I think one point is that when a lot of people take the test, they're under this mistaken assumption that the higher you score on everything, the more hardcore of a gamer you are, the more of a gamer you are.
Right.
But
Right.
I
Right.
think the important thing to keep in mind is that both high and low scores on those motivations are valid gameplay motivations and mechanics. That someone who scores low on community doesn't mean, sure, it means that you don't like spending a lot of time in teams, but that means you like solo mechanics. You like mechanics that, um,
Right.
things that you can do on your own without being forced into a team. And so it's actually descriptive and interesting on both sides of that scale.
Can you talk about, I think that's very interesting. More is not always necessarily better. Can you can you talk about the application of this idea of gamer motivational types outside of the strict construct of gaming? And I understand that that's what you've been looking at, that's how you've normed it. But one of the central questions for
Yeah,
gamification people is, can this, if you like to play games in this way, or this is your type in a game, is this also something that will apply to the world outside of games, or can I bring some of those gaming elements that you might really like when you're playing a game into your real world and motivate you similarly?
sure.
Can you
Yeah,
talk about just
so
your thoughts about that or what you know? Hmm.
Yeah, so when we were putting the tool together, in addition to the motivation scale, we also included a standardized personality test, the big five personality traits from personality psychology, as as kind of like another triangulation point when we got the results back. And so we had people who took both, and so we can look at their data. What we found was that the um, gaming motivations align with personality traits. So people who are conscientious, they're planners, they like to think long term offline in the real world. They're the people who like strategy in games. The people who are extroverted offline, they're the people who like community and competition, within the games. The people who are score high on openness to experience, who are imaginative and adventurous offline, they're the people who like fantasy and design and discovery in the games. And there are these positive correlations between the personality traits and the gaming motivations. So there's this kind of like personality. There's this mid-level of gaming motivations. It's how personality is kind of expressed on the game layer. So what it means is that, when we're measuring gaming motivations, it's kind of a way of it picks up some of those personality traits, along the way. We don't think that the gaming motivation model is the most direct measure, for example, of all
Of regular
everyday
personality.
desires and
Sure.
exactly, but
Sure,
there's
sure,
some
sure.
kind of overlap. Yeah,
Well, and I think it's especially it's mostly interesting to people as a as a paradigm for thinking about how we step from just like kind of generally who you are to how we design something that you're going to find interesting, right? And I think that's actually that little bit
exactly.
of sort of extra insight. Like if you're really not into playing community, for example, so in your model, community team play is just really not interesting to you, then when we're designing a team play experience in your workplace, right? You may also similarly not be that into this team play in your workplace if you're not into it in games. And that's
Yeah,
been kind of the big question. And I can tell you, and I can tell you from my side, not to represent everybody who's listening or watching or in the gamification business, but that is definitely an interesting question that I think many folks in business in industry really want to understand outside of games, um, particularly for their employees. I'm very curious about
yeah,
this question.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
one, I get one kind of one question from Rock, who I guess is a new viewer. Hi, Rock. Welcome for joining. Welcome to the Gamification Revolution. Okay, so Rock's question is about measuring the physiological. He's actually asking about dopamine release of people who are playing
Dopamine.
things or experiencing things. And so I want to kind of ask you a bigger question and in answering kind of Rock's question here, which is about, so what is your view of and what do you think we should be doing as it relates to measuring kind of the physiological reactions of people? Because there's this whole other layer. So one layer is the self-reported data. This is
Yeah.
your work at Quantic Foundry is based on self-reported data. But there's also this whole layer of objective, empirical, how are
Yeah.
people feeling while they're actually playing this thing? So what's your understanding of the state of the art there, and what do you think we ought to be doing to flesh that out, or is that even important?
Yeah, I think the triangulation is important. So the way I got into big data in games was during the MMO era, right around World of Warcraft, when they suddenly pushed out, via the Armory, all the in-game metrics of players was accessible via, the Armory website. And so that was my entry point into this intersection. And so I'm always very aware of that triangulation between self-report data and actual in-game data. So we did this 3-year project with the government where their question was just by looking at how someone's character behaves in World of Warcraft, can you predict their offline gender, age, and personality? So we've done a lot of these projects that triangulate between, self-report measures and in-game measures. I haven't done a lot with physio measures, myself, but that triangulation between actual behavioral measures and self-report measures and validating the two has always, been in the mix of things that we do and trying to make sense of both. Again, when you look only at the behavioral data in games, oftentimes you're not quite sure why people are doing what they're doing. So that's where the self-report piece comes in. And like you said, if you only look at the self-report, then you're not quite sure that people actually do what they say they do. So we try our hardest to do that triangulation. And a lot of the work that we do for our clients is actually doing the in-game metrics analysis paired with a self-report motivation tool.
Very interesting. Well, Nick, this is so fascinating. I know that almost everybody who's watching today is going to want to take the gamer motivation survey that you built for sure. If they haven't already taken it, they're going to want to share it with other people. Some of them have already been talking about people they really want to share it with, and that they're going to want to use and access some of that data from you probably so they can reach out, I'm sure, and pay you some money to
Please
access
do,
that
yeah.
data if they need to. Yes, please do, because it's Quantic Foundry is a great startup that Nick is running. You can follow Nick on Twitter at Quantic Foundry, right? And you can follow me at G Zichermann. Thanks so much, Nikki. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, absolutely.
So great to have you. Really fascinating. I can't wait for you guys all to take your gamer motivation score on Quantic's website, and so we can all compare them the next time I get to see you all in person. And for those of you who haven't yet, you can sign up and contribute to Gamification by Design too at gamificationbydesign.com and add your contributions to kind of this main reference guide for gamification. Nikki, thanks so much. Everybody else, thank you for joining us on the Gamification Revolution. We'll see you soon. In the meantime, keep having fun, everybody.